cognitive load refers to the amount of mental effort that the brain uses to process and retain information. It's a concept that we should all be talking about within the context of learning, and we're not. Today, we'll do a deep dive into it to address this shortfall. My name is Blair Lee, and I'm your host of this YouTube series. This is Homeschooling. A big reason we should all be talking about this is that if too much information comes at someone too quickly, they can have cognitive overload. And when this happens, kids can shut down or just not really be able to do the work, even if they're trying. And so it's really important that you take the time to assess what your child's cognitive load is. There are three parts to cognitive load, and they're all pretty easy to understand once you know what they are. Intrinsic cognitive load, extraneous cognitive load, and germane cognitive load. Now, the intrinsic cognitive load is just how challenging the material is, and it can vary by subject or by person. For example, someone who thinks math is really easy does not find math to have a high cognitive load, but someone who is challenged by math concepts does. Extraneous cognitive load is all of the outside things that are affecting the cognitive load. This can be an itchy tag in your t-shirt, or it can be materials, how easy they are to understand, or if they're kind of hard to understand. And then there's germane cognitive load. Now, germane cognitive load really refers to the natural process your brain uses to structure information. It creates something that scientists call schema. Schema are simply the cognitive framework. And the germane cognitive load really is where you want to pay attention if you're not somebody that thinks that you should be learning things early. Those early childhood learning things that we refer to all the time, or that I'm always talking about, those Velcro hooks. That's the schema that's being created in your brain so that when new learning happens, it goes through your brain as you start to process it in one of these Velcro hooks that's already a schema, that's already a framework in your brain, grabs it and organizes it in that area. And that's the three types of cognitive load. The benefits of effectively managing cognitive load for your learner are pretty significant. You'll get increased engagement from kids who aren't as stressed out, and that makes for happier learners, and happier learners are so much more fun to work with. Then there's the benefit of enhanced retention. Enhanced retention means your kids remember more of what they've learned. And finally, they have an increased ability to think critically. Why? Well, because if you're relaxed, it's much easier to go through your schema and figure out what you've already learned and begin applying it within the context of current learning. In order to manage cognitive load, you have to figure out where your child's cognitive load and what it is. And that is best done through observation. Is your child breezing through materials? Then maybe you could make them more challenging. Are they struggling? Are they unhappy? Do they seem frustrated or fatigued? Your child's behavior when they're working on material offers valuable insight into the cognitive load. You're going to also want to ask some reflective questions to figure out if your child's learning something. Think of cognitive load like a pitcher. The brain is like a pitcher, and you're pouring water into this pitcher. The water would be knowledge, and it gets to be too much, and it just starts overflowing. So if you throw too much information at someone, it's like it just leaks out their ear. There's too much. They can't handle it all. And that is really frustrating, but it also affects how someone sees themselves as a learner. So ask reflective questions to see if they're learning. And then if you suspect that your child might be struggling with cognitive overload, adjust for complexity. look at material or a program or an online class and figure out what is the most important points that are being taught. And if you're dealing with another instructor, you can actually ask them, look, if we cut out sort of the stuff we can get to later, what are the most important things, strands that need to be learned? Include hands-on learning. A lot of kids do better when they can work with their hands, when there's some movement associated with learning. And too often the kinesthetic component is taken out. Now, you want to be careful. You want to make sure you don't have a child that adds to the extraneous load for them, but those children are not as common as the children that benefit from having some kinesthetic component. And then gradually increase the challenges as you see your child working. And the reason you want to gradually increase the challenges is that you're actually increasing their cognitive load, and that can really benefit them so that eventually their cognitive load will be where your cognitive load is. If you've ever thought to yourself, why aren't they getting this? They should be getting this. I would be learning this. Well, maybe you would at your age, but you don't know where you would have been when you were their age. That's because the adult's cognitive load is much larger than a child's, and that's because we have had a lot more experience with learning, and we have much broader schema and more schema. If you're starting to think to yourself, hey Blair, how can I identify cognitive overload? Well, I've got some tips. Now, of course, everybody's an individual, and so it might look really different for your child. But does your child have outbursts around school? Look for a decreased focus, mental fatigue, increased mistakes, doesn't like school. So one of my grandchildren has really been struggling with cognitive overload. Nobody was aware of it. I just figured it out, actually, because I said, let Grandma get involved and figure out why he's struggling to learn. What I realized is that he was overloaded, and what it manifested as he didn't like school. Well, the next thing we know, he loves school. He wants to go to school every day because we got him over the hurdle. In case you're wondering, he needed to learn his letters, and they were having them learn 4 letters at once. Well, he needed just to be learning 1 letter at once. 4 was getting all mixed up in his brain. So he couldn't figure out, he was working on the letters M, A, S, and T, and he couldn't figure out what sound the M made or the A made or the S made because which one sounded like which? It was just like a mix in there and all muddled. So you pay attention, look for negative behaviors around school, and then figure out how you can minimize the load associated with the task at hand. That's if you're going to plan with cognitive load in mind. But what if you're in the middle of something? By the time this episode comes out, most people aren't going to be starting out. They're going to be in the middle. So what sort of strategies can you use if you need to keep using a program or you want to keep using a program? Well, one of the first things you're going to want to look at is the learning modalities that benefit your child. You can think of learning modalities similar to the extraneous load. Those learning modalities that your child uses learning best have lower extraneous load than those that they don't. And so even if the program doesn't include materials or components that key into your child's preferred learning modalities, you can go out and find resources that do, and that will really benefit their learning. Like I already mentioned, parse out the essential concepts and just focus on those. You can streamline what is being learned and what is being asked of your child by just treating some concepts and skills. We'll get to those later. Minimize where you can so that there's just less information that your child has to deal with. In this case, less can be more if it helps with learning, with cognitive load. Less can be more benefits learning outcomes when the cognitive load is manageable. You're going to want to also make sure that you're helping your child activate schema. You homeschool, you know what they already learned. So help them make connections with current learning to past learning so that they can use that to make their cognitive load more manageable. And finally, if you need to, be your child's study buddy. I did this a couple of times. My son really struggled with the organization side of taking notes, so I took a class with him. I'm a great note taker, and one of the key components of that class was note taking. I made notes, he made notes, we compared our notes. I then knew what sort of information and input he needed to help him on the next level for note taking. Yep, study buddies. It's actually one of the more fun things I ever did with homeschooling with him. Many of you listening to this likely are homeschooling children who are neurodivergent learners. If you have a neurodivergent learner, cognitive load is one of the first things that you should think about when introducing academics to them. It's one of the reasons I'm so surprised we're not all talking about this in our community, because of the number of people who are homeschooling neurodivergent learners. And I recommend for a neurodivergent learner that you take the time to take notes and really monitor where you see your child's cognitive load at this time. Make a focus of learning on how you can slowly increase their cognitive load. Be very thoughtful. If there's anything that you're asking your child to do that adds to their extraneous load, I like to use the example of myself just because it's really easy and I can't misspeak. If I do, I have hearing issues, and anything that asks me to learn using auditory, sound, if there's any extra sounds going on at this outside, it can be overwhelming for me, even when the material isn't overwhelming. There are simple situations that I simply can't manage if there's too much auditory stimulation going on. And so you be really thoughtful of that. Take the time to journal, to make notes, to evaluate how your child responds if they're feeling overloaded. Start to give your child language, help modeling for them how they might advocate for themselves if that's something that works for your child. I don't want to be ableist with this, but help them find language that they can use, possibly, to just let you know that they can't handle anymore. And then back away. Take a vacation day, and then really, really look for every single thing that might be adding to the extraneous load. Help your children activate their schema. And this is where it is so beneficial when working with your neurodivergent learner to pay a lot of attention to the past learning. And if they work with specialists, stay on top of what sort of work they're doing with those specialists so that you can help your child activate schema anytime they're learning new materials. We're homeschoolers, which means we're educators, and most educators have a goal of encouraging intellectual growth. And one of the key components to that is to thoughtfully increase cognitive load. So some strategies that you can use. Well, this is why it's so great that homeschoolers know what their children have been learning, because activating schema, building on existing knowledge, is a key component to increasing cognitive load. You can also help with metacognitive skills by asking open-ended questions that hope will get your child to retrieve retained information and apply it in the context of current learning. That activates schema, builds schema, and makes the schema that kids already have more robust, but it also begins helping kids connect learning in a way that leads to cognitive growth. Problem solving is another great strategy. And so this is why project-based learning, as many of you know, I'm a big fan. But problem-based learning also works, where you get somebody so engaged that they're willing to push their brain and their learning. That is an important component to building cognitive load, is actually getting some buy-in. Some of the kids, you don't have to get them to say, hey, yeah, okay, I agree, let's start working on my cognitive load. You could just encourage it by bringing in these problems that kids get really engaged with solving. It's a component of that work to promote independence within learning, so that kids challenge themselves. Hey, you want to learn about black holes? Go for it. And then ask them questions. Use the Socratic method so that you can help them parse through what they've learned and then help them make connections to past learning and current learning. If you want more details about cognitive load, I have an article that has more details in the October 2024 See Homeschoolers magazine. It is free, and we'll have a link in the description once that magazine comes out. There's another article in there that talks about what cognitive science can tell you about learning, that touches a little bit on cognitive load, but it goes into quite a bit of detail in other areas. I've got some future talks that focus on some of those areas. If you've got any questions as you try to figure out your child's cognitive load, if you want any help from me, please leave a comment and I will be happy to help you figure out whatever you need to figure out as you start to work on what is actually a very important thing that we should all be focusing on within the context of learning. Don't forget to like, subscribe, click the notification bell, and thanks for listening.